Hi everyone, 16th installment of Dennis Deep Cuts coming your way. This fine YouTube series where I talk about music, culture, art, and nerdy stuff that I like. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics in the entire world, and it's hardcore music. Specifically 80s hardcore music, and today we're diving in on the hardcore compilation albums of the 80s. Let's see what happens. One of the most fascinating artifacts of the 80s has got to be the hardcore compilation albums. Beautiful documentations of a time and a scene and a place existed all over the world. Today we're going to focus on the American hardcore scene from the early to the mid 80s, just because there's so many compilations that came out of this world. In true DIY spirit, bands and people got together, started on record labels, and they got their friends and their peers together and they put up records. And for a lot of bands, this was maybe the only way to get your music out on vinyl. And for a lot of bands, this was a starting point of a career. You put out a couple of songs on a compilation, then maybe you put out a 7-inch, and then you might put out an album. So we're going to take a look at that and see what that is. There's plenty of cool international hardcore compilations as well. That might be another episode, but today we're digging in on American hardcore compilations. The compilation wasn't really a new idea when this happened. As early as the 50s, like labels could compile their biggest artists on an album to showcase their roster or the greatest hits records. That's a compilation basically of your singles or your greatest hits. But the hardcore compilations were different because all these bands were small and most of them were quite insignificant. But they had their little world and they had their little scene, and these are beautiful documentations of that. I got my start on a hardcore compilation. My first band, my first real band, Step Forward, put out 3 songs on Really Fast Volume 6. Here it is. And this is the first time I had anything released on vinyl, and it's still pretty awesome. We had 2 demos out, and they got in touch and they said, do you want to be on this compilation? And I think we paid $150 and we got 50 copies, and that's just kind of how you did it. So let's do this. Let's look at American hardcore from the 80s and some really cool hardcore compilations. There's a ton of music here, and you might discover some bands you never heard of or some compilations you never seen before. So let's do this. Alright, let's once again start in sunny California like we did on the Goth Rock episode. 1979, one of the first punk and hardcore compilations to be released in America is the Tooth and Nail compilation. It's released in 1979 on Upsetter Records. At this point, in the UK there's already been a bunch of punk compilations, but this is one of the first American ones. Upsetter Records was started by Chris D from the Flesh Eaters, and they mostly put out some of his stuff, but they also put out this fantastic compilation. All the bands on the comp, apart from UXA, had already released 7-inches at this point, which is quite unique, and it's a killer compilation. Everything is recorded in the same studio, apart from the Negative Trend songs are recorded somewhere else, but everything is recorded in the same studio, so it has a coherency and a cohesiveness, and it sounds great. The Germs tracks did end up on their full-length record GI, but in a different recording, and everything on this record is great. Controls are great, the Flesh Eaters are great, and Middle Class once again proves why they're one of the first real hardcore bands out there. And superb compilation of early LA punk and hardcore stuff. Tooth and Nail. Let's stick around in LA for a little bit longer. There's so many great compilations coming out of LA in this time period. Maybe it had something to do with the closeness to the music industry and the entertainment business, but there's just like, I mean, I could probably do 3 or 4 episodes just about LA punk compilations. One of my favorite punk and hardcore bands is, of course, Suicidal Tendencies. They put out their first record in 1983, and then it wasn't until 1987 that they put out their follow-up, Join the Army. In the interim, there were some issues with the label, there were some issues with band members. Most importantly, there were some issues with the authorities. After some riots and Suicidal Tendencies affiliation with gang members, they were not allowed to play in Los Angeles for a very, very long time. So the singer of Suicidal Tendencies, Mike Muir, started his own label called, of course, Suicidal Records, and in 1985 they put out the Welcome to Venice compilation, which is just fantastic. I like how when we talk about the compilations, it's usually like a scene. It's like the Midwest or, you know, Texas or Boston, but Venice Beach, 5 bands, and what a compilation this is. It's all 5 bands are great. It's very thrashy crossover hardcore in the vein of like later era Suicidal Tendencies. Well, Join the Army, that kind of era Suicidal Tendencies. It has a Suicidal Tendencies track called Look Up, which is the only song that they released in between 83 and 87, and it's just a killer track. It also has Mike's short-lived project Los Psychos, and 2 of the staples of the Venice Beach hardcore scene, Excel and Beowulf, and those bands are both great. But one of the real treats is the No Mercy tracks. It's the 2 No Mercy tracks with their first singer. After this compilation, Mike from the Suicidal Tendencies started singing in No Mercy, and in 1987 they put out one of the best crossover records of all time, Widespread Bloodshed. But if you like your hardcore to be crossover and gang related and just amazing, you need to check out the Welcome to Venice LP. It should be staple in everyone's record collection. Yeah. Let's head to the Midwest and see what happens in the Midwest. In 1979 in Indianapolis, the Zero Boys got started. The Zero Boys is one of the finest punk and hardcore bands of all time. The first 7-inch living in the 80s, and their first album Civilization's Dying is some of the finest music that's ever been put on vinyl. Their singer Paul Marr started Affirmation Records and put out this fantastic compilation called The Master Tape in 1983. Everything is recorded in the same studio. Paul Marr actually was and became a studio technician, and he's been working with John Mellencamp, and he's like a really heavy hitter in that world nowadays. But back in the 80s, he put together this compilation with some really great names. You have bands like Toxic Reason, you have, of course, the Zero Boys, Articles of Fate, the FUs out of Boston, and Die Kreuzen, some of the really heavy hitters of early 80s hardcore. And it's all great. All the songs, apart from the Toxic Reason songs, are all exclusive for this record. And then you have a bunch of really cool bands like Slammies, Battered Youth, Delinquents, and Learned Helplessness with their song Veggies, which is early animal rights vegan song that I really, really love. This is a great compilation. They put out a Master Tapes Volume 2 later on that it's also fantastic. And yeah, just a great representation of Midwest hardcore of the early 80s. Needs to be checked Let's head over to Boston. If you know anything about hardcore, you know that one of the best hardcore compilations of all time is 1982's This Is Boston, Not LA, which I assume, you know, is a slight on the fact that there's so many compilations coming out of LA. That's a fantastic compilations with Boston bands. But apparently that was not all that was happening in Boston at the time, because 2 years later, in 1984, Bands That Could Be God, the Conflict compilation, is released. And one of the things it says in the liner notes is that bands like SSD and Proletariat doesn't need the exposure, and there's more stuff happening in Boston than you know. So it's a little bit of a, I don't know, maybe this compilation is by bands that were not allowed to be on the This Is Boston, Not LA comp, and they put out their own compilation. But this is really cool. It's a bit uneven, and it's not front to back hardcore. Some of the bands like Christmas and Salem 66 is more indie rock, but it has some really cool stuff in it. It has some Moving Target tracks before they became more indie, where it's just Moving Target just play hardcore basically. And one really cool band that I really like is a band called the Outpatients. The Outpatients put out a pretty cool like crossover thrash record in the late 80s, and there's a couple of Outpatient songs on this record which is full on hardcore. And then the winner of this record is of course two Deep Wound tracks. Deep Wound is Jay Mascis from Dynasty Jr.'s first hardcore band where he plays drums, and Deep Wound are just amazingly good. So if you want to check out more Boston music than This Is Boston, Not LA, you can check out the Bands That Could Be God compilation, because it has some really cool Boston stuff on it, and some of the indie stuff is also really cool. Yeah, check it out. In the early 80s, one thing that defined Boston was its rivalry to New York. So let's go to New York, you know. One of the most important pieces of hardcore history was released in 1982 in New York, and it's the New York Trash compilation released on Roar tapes, I guess. And then when most people think about New York hardcore, they think about like the late 80s, like the Youth Crew, straight edge hardcore scene. But in between all of this, in 1985, Big City Records released this record called Big Cities, One Big Crowd. It has 20 bands on it, and it's super cool. Big City was a record label by this guy called Javi that also did a scene called Big City. And this is New York hardcore before it became Youth Crew. New York hardcore when it's still kind of raw and wild. And I love the fact that it's called like, you know, it's like a New York hardcore compilation, but the A side is all New York bands, and then the B side, half of it's New Jersey and half of it's Connecticut. It's 20 bands on this, and a lot of bands such as Psychos and Bloodlust and bands like that. This is the only piece of vinyl they ever put out. And then you have some, I wouldn't say bigger bands, but you have bands like Sheer Terror when they just play full on hardcore. And then you have Adrenaline OD from Jersey, and you have Bedlam from Jersey, and you have Violent Children, which became Youth of Today later on. It's a super cool compilation of that that mid 80s hardcore after punk, before Youth Crew, and I just love this compilation. Pretty much everything Big City put out up until the last couple of releases they put out some weird like heavy metal stuff, but everything up until that is just also really, really good hardcore stuff. So if you want to check out 20 quite obscure New York hardcore bands, One Big Crowd. And speaking of New York hardcore, New York City Hardcore the way it is. This compilation, I got it when it came out, and I listened to this one so much, and this was very much my introduction to that whole scene that I just talked about, the youth crew sort of hardcore scene with bands like Youth Today, Gorilla Biscuits, Warzone, Side by Side, and Sick of It All. And this compilation is just fantastic. If you want an introduction to that world of hardcore, yeah, this is the one. Revelation Records that put this out was started in 1987 by Ray Capo from Youth Today and Jordan. And Jordan still runs the label, but not from New York anymore. He has actually been out in California for the past 20 years, maybe. In 1987, they put out a compilation called Together, and this is like an expansion of that. It's just more bands and more songs, and yeah, it's just great. There's a couple of smaller bands on there, and there's a couple of inclusions that today might see a bit misplaced, like Nausea and Youth Defense League, but all in all, this is just a fantastic compilation, and yeah, it really changed the trajectory of what hardcore was in the later 80s, I would say, like this whole scene and this whole world, and it is very different from the compilation One Big Crowd. It's just like 3 years before this. None of those people, none of those bands are involved at all, and it's like a new world and a new world of hardcore that really defined late 80s and early 90s hardcore. And yeah, I love this compilation, and yeah, cool. Let's head to DC and the compilation of all compilations on the label of all labels. I am, of course, talking about Flex Your Head. This is released in January 1982 on Discord Records, and it's very much like the blueprint for what everyone did. It's a very regional thing. It's only DC punk and hardcore bands, and it's like a very, very spectacular documentation of that scene. Discord Records was started by Ian and Jeff from Minor Threat, and you can see there's a little bit of a pattern emerging here where singers of bands start their own record label, and then they put out cool compilations that we can partake in right now. This, as I said, this was released in January 1982. By the point this record came out, almost all the bands of the record were broken up or were broken up within a year. I think that past 1982, I think that only Void, Government Issue, and Iron Cross survived. Minor Threat was actually broken up when this record came out, but they got back together. And this is just, if you want to know anything about DC hardcore, this is the compilation with Teen Idols. It's fantastic that Teen Idols became Minor Threat. Untouchables became Faith. State of Alert, they were broken up by this time because Henry joined Black Flag. And then you have Minor Threat. They was broken up at this point, but then they got back together. GI, Government Issue, they're great. They put out a bunch of records. Youth Brigade, they only put 1 7-inch in this, the tracks on this compilation. Red Sea, only in this compilation. Void, they put out one of the greatest records of all time with the Void split. Iron Cross, they did some more stuff. Artificial Peace, I think they only put up this compilation as well. And then Deadline, that Posthumous put out a really cool record. I mean, this is probably one of my favorite compilations of all time. Everything is great about it. At least 3 out of the people in Fake Names are on this record. I'm not one of them. But I have all 4 different artworks. Well, yeah, do yourself a favor, check out Flex Your Head. It's one of the coolest, best hardcore compilations of all time. If you like your hardcore to be fast and short and sharp. So yeah, please do it. let's talk about another DC hardcore compilation, and I would say a little bit of the inspiration for this episode. Last episode I talked about goth rock, and I mentioned the compilation Mixed Nuts Don't Crack because Monica from Madhouse used to be in a band called Hit From Ignorance that was on that compilation, and here it is. And this is released in 1983, and I have a distinct feeling that maybe these bands were not allowed to be on the Discord compilation, so they put out their own records. Out of all the bands on this record, United Mutation is the only band. United Mutation and Nuclear Crayons are the only bands that actually put out records outside of this compilation. Media Disease, Chalkline, Social Suicide, and Hate From Ignorance. I think this is like the only stuff they released in the 80s. I mean, there's been both Chalkline and Media Disease has had like compilations with all their recording material. Some of the stuff like Nuclear Crayons and Chalkline is a bit more post-punkish, but you have Media Disease and United Mutations that's just super fast, super thrashy hardcore. And this is just a really cool compilation of the DC bands that weren't Discord enough to be on Discord. I think, probably, possibly. But yeah, it's great. Let's finish up with two records that are more American hardcore and not regional. And the first one I want to talk about is this record from 1986, Another Shot for Bracken. This is released on Positive Force Records, which is Kevin Seconds from 7 Seconds label. By the mid-80s, hardcore in the States had taken, it went in kind of all directions. And I think this compilation is a beautiful sort of representation of that it's there's a lot of styles of hardcore on it, and it's bands from all across America. There's some well-known names like Flag of Democracy, Scream, of course you have 7 Seconds, and you have Youth of Today and Adrenaline OD on it, but there's also a whole slew of bands I guess only put out songs on this compilation, such as the really rad track by Dissonance and a really cool track by a band called Care Unit. All in all, this is a really cool comp for that if you want to check out that time and that place of the mid-80s. Yeah, and it's also very cheap, so you don't have to pay any big bucks for it. So let's finish up with the only compilation album here that has all previously released stuff on it, but it's also one of the most important compilations of American hardcore to ever be released, or at least in the early 80s. It's of course Let Them All Eat Jelly Beans on Alternative Tentacles. Alternative Tentacles was one of the most important punk record labels of the 80s and 90s, and it was started by Jello Biafra, the singer of the Dead Kennedys, and the International Noise Conspiracy actually put out a live record on Alternative Tentacles, which was quite huge when that happened. Even though no one really cared about that, it was still awesome for us. Anyway, Jello put together this record to sort of showcase what American hardcore was all about in the early 80s. It's released in 1981. And it's also one of the earliest hardcore compilations I ever heard. Someone had a tape of this, and they gave it to me, I think already in maybe 87 or 88. And the A side is just like a greatest hits with fantastic bands such as Black Flag, Bad Brains, Circle Jerks, Dead Kennedys, and you have from Canada you have DOA and Subhumans, and you have bands like Flipper. And then the B side is a bit more art rocky and new wavy and weird, and when I was young, I didn't like the B-side as much, but the older I get, the more I enjoy the B-side. And as I said, all this stuff is previously released. It's taken from records of 7 inches. But Black Flag's Police Story, it says on the record that it's the Henry Rollins version of Black Flag, but it's actually Des Cadena that sings, and I think it might be exclusive to this record. And then also Dead Kennedy's song Nazi Punks Fuck Off is a different version than the one that's on the 7 inch. Plus the Bad Brains Paid to Come track is taken from their 7 inch. It's not taken from their first album. But yeah, I mean, this was a massively important record, and I think one that really propelled American hardcore to the rest of the world. And there you have it. 10 pretty cool, pretty awesome, I would say, hardcore compilations of the 80s. Which one's your favorite? Which one did I forget about? And yeah, so on and so forth. Like, share, subscribe, all that. Thank you for watching me continue to be a nerd about these things. And until next time, stay wild, my friends.